Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining for this very important and a very interesting session with a set of panelists, co-panelists with me, who are very well versed with all the issues we're going to discuss. This is about the institution of independent directors. I think this is gained momentum and actually has gained major importance after several issues which have happened with corporate India, where governance failures did happen. And we've been learning how to build this institution as one of the key pillars of driving governance ahead. And this session, ideally titled as Role and Responsibility, there's an element of liability which is increasingly coming on the independent directors, and we'll hear from them. Before getting into the whole issue, I think what we will focus on is how the role of independent directors has evolved. What are the key focus areas? Has there been anything the COVID has done to the institution of independent directors? I've got four panelists who are well versed with very different backgrounds. Mr. Jagdish Kapoor, Mr. Adil Zainalbai, and then Mr. Ashish Kumar Chavan, and Ms. Anjali Bansal. Let me briefly introduce them broadly. I think let me start with Anjali. Anjali is the founder of Avana Capital, and with this one invests in scaling up innovation-led startups. But prior, she's also invested and mentored several of the entities like Delivery, Urban Clap, Nika. She's associated with Niti Aayog Women Entrepreneurship Platform. She was the executive chairperson of Dena Bank, appointed by Government of India, a non-executive chairperson, and then it got merged with Bank of Baroda. And prior to that, she was with private equity, TPG looking after Southeast Asia, Africa, and Middle East, and has started career as a consultant from McKinsey. We have two McKinsey alumnus today on the panel, so we will hear from them two different perspectives. And she served on several boards, including Tata Power, Bata, Kotak AMC, Pyramid Enterprises, and she's also chairing India Board of Women World Banking. And she's been elected president designate of Bombay Chamber of Commerce and has worked on CI National Committee on Corporate Governance. Also chaired a Center of Corporate Governance program for women. I think that's something which we need to also talk about in terms of diversity in boards. And with that rich background, we're going to hear from her perspectives on this institution of independent directors. Then we have Mr. Ashish Chauhan. He is, as you know, the CEO and Managing Director of Bombay Stock Exchange, Asia's oldest exchange, and today is the world's fastest exchange with microsecond response time and has over 5,000 listed companies. And he was also instrumental in setting up Mr. Narendra Modi in January 2017. He's worked in several responsibilities, including in Reliance Industries as a group CIO and also CEO of cricket team Mumbai Indians in the formative years. So a very good mix of corporate and let's say an institution which covers several corporates and also I would say continues to work on several other initiatives, including being on the board of IIM Raipur and also associated with the Shailesh J. Mehta School of Management. With all this experience, plus oversight of having looked at how the various stock exchanges and the practices across various countries, I think you'll provide also the international flavor of where India stands in terms of in terms of these governance practices. Uh, Adil, of course, we all know him. He's been advisor to many of the corporate companies in his years in McKinsey. He also is the president of HBS Alumni Association. And after working in McKinsey, where he supported several companies in US, in Office of Washington, DC, across telecom, consumer electronics, energy, banking, he served on several boards, also works on several nonprofits. I'm going to speak about them because I think we also have to give while we also sort of frame the economic framework in American and India Foundation, in CII National Council, SciFi Hospital. All these are institutions which are building a better India. Also works on Wockhardt Foundation, health management. In addition to his focus on health, he works on the quality movement in India as the chairman of Quality Council of India. Uh, Lastly, we have someone who's been in the corporate world for a very, very long time, Mr. Jagdish Kapoor, who's to join this committee in this set of panel. We will, when he joins, we will get him on into the section as he joins. He was the Deputy Governor of Reserve Bank and currently Chairman of Manappuram Finance Limited. In addition to that, he's held several responsibilities, including chairmanship of Bombay Stock Exchange, where Ashish is now, and HDFC Bank, and currently is also on the Board of Governors of Indian Institute of Management, Indore. So that really is a very rich set of panel. I'm going to sort of open it up with the panelists giving their perspective on the evolving role of independent directors. What do they think are the plus and minuses which have happened over the years, their learnings from their experience, and what can be done, and also anything specific they have actually imbibed during this period of COVID, which can throw the light in making this institution even more stronger. So let me start with Adil, with you to give us an overall perspective. You've seen both government, non-government, and also you've been advising companies and the practices. Over to you, Adil.
Thank you very much, Mukundan, and welcome to this seminar, and welcome to all of our esteemed panelists who have all been on very interesting boards and hopefully will bring very interesting and diverse perspectives. I think if you look at the news these days about independent directors, and if you listen to the regulators, it's always about when the institution of independent directors failed, and therefore the government feels the need to come up with new regulation to tighten it. If you look at many of the companies that have had a failure of governance, in addition to the executive management, etc., there's been a spotlight on the role of independent directors. So almost everything you hear and read has to do with the negative aspects of when that governance system failed. In reality, as you look at the very large number of companies in India that are public and even private companies, actually the role of independent directors, especially in the better managed ones, has been a very, very positive governance mechanism and has helped our companies become world class in many areas and has improved the overall quality of governance across many fields. So let me talk about that part. Fortunately, I have not been an independent director in companies that have failed or where malfeasance occurred. So that's a very good thing to be at. So my experience has been in what does one do as an independent director to make sure that the companies are both successful, compliant, and have not fallen into that trap that some companies have fallen into. Um, so let me talk a little bit about what does one do as an independent director that helps the company do that. I think one role of the independent director is obviously to protect the investment of all the shareholders. It's both the minority shareholders, the majority shareholders, the promoters, etc. And the independent director has to look at that and make sure that that is protected. What does that mean? It means that paying a lot of attention to ensuring that the company is in compliance, it's not breaking any rules or regulation, it is following those in the spirit that those regulations were designed. If you do that, you're protecting it. But that doesn't mean that makes the company successful. And I think that's the second part of it. Most regulations have to do with, are you fulfilling your responsibilities for compliance? And I'll come back to that in a little bit and the pressure that that puts on one. But I want to also point out the other part, which is the role of the independent director is to help the company also put in place many things that will help make it successful. It's not the role of the independent director to create the strategy for the company. It is not the role of the independent director to run the company, but it is to help guide the company so that in fact it makes good decisions, to test the decisions they're making, to test the strategy, to look at the systems they've put in place and test those, as opposed to developing them from ground up, which is the role of executive management. If an independent director starts behaving like executive management, then in fact, that is the wrong thing to do. And you don't have enough time in the day to actually do that, then you might as well join as executive management. But I think the way the independent director can play that role very well is what are the questions that you ask? What are the things that you push on to make sure that you are comfortable, that in fact the company is, is complying, it has good financial systems, and that the decisions that it is taking, both on investments and directions it's going in, have been well thought through. And I think that part really, really helps the company moving forward. In the best companies and in well-run companies, many of which, as you all know now, are now worth hundreds of, lakhs of crores and are coming on the global scene. The role of good independent directors has been extraordinarily valuable to the company in helping them make sure that they're thinking about the future, their investments, and others going forward. And I think that is a part that we never talk about, because regulation and the government is always interested only in the negative aspect of compliance rather than the positive aspect of making the company's governance better and making sure that it is the companies are being successful. So how does one do that? And let me just spend a few minutes on it, and then I will pass it on and we can think about other questions as we go forward. A great example of that is what happened during the COVID times, when all of a sudden the issues about what a company should do became extremely urgent. And nobody had time to think about this for years and years, but had to make a set of decisions very quickly. And if I, at least on all the companies that I'm on the board of, the pace and cadence of the meetings stepped up a lot during this time. The questions that we asked of the management helped them figure out what to do on COVID. And one of the things that independent directors brought to the board was learnings from what they have seen in other companies that have done certain aspects of this well. And that helped many companies that I'm on the board of learn from the other companies that I've been on the board of and make a huge improvement in how they were reacting to COVID, the pace at which they were reacting to COVID, and how they dealt with their employees, how they dealt with financing issues that might come up, how they thought about cash, how they thought about the outlook for the business, et cetera, et cetera. And I think in that part, because it happened so fast, the independent directors could play a very good role in helping the companies do that. And that's an example of how, in fact, you could do it. On a very practical note, and then I will end, just one of the things that I do on compliance and others is, first of all, I, read a lot of the news about what went wrong at other companies. And one of the things that we question as independent directors in all our companies, we question the management, the auditors, the internal auditors and the external auditors on how those things went wrong in those companies, and are any of those circumstances present in the current company, so that we can understand and we don't fall into the same trap. For example, many of the companies where things went wrong, there were lots of related party transactions between subsidiaries of subsidiaries of subsidiaries between them. Obviously, as an independent director, you can't go through the thousands and find them. But I've noticed that if you ask questions and you probe a little bit, then the entire management system improves. And if you probe the auditors, internal auditors, and the external auditors to ensure that those transactions have been looked at, then you put in place a system where those things cannot go wrong. So I'll end by saying the independent director can play an extremely important role, both in compliance and making sure that the company is functioning and not breaking any laws and all of that, as well as, and then almost more importantly, in how it's thinking about the future, how it's thinking about the investments it's making. And a lot of that has to do with despite the fact that an independent director spends, maybe anywhere between 10 and 30 days a year at a company, if you ask the right questions, if you probe in the right places, that creates enormous value for the company, because they have to, especially if their intentions are good, they will think about it and answer those questions and make the changes necessary that are inherent in those questions. So I think how you ask a question and what questions you ask is a very important role for an independent director. So with that, let me hand it over back to you, Mukundan. I think I've spoken for quite long, and then we'll answer any other questions that come up. Thank you.
Thank you, Adil. As always, I think you raised the level by saying it is not just to protect investment, but to make successful. And I think you've given a very practical point of view, saying that ask the right questions. You're not there to replace the executive management and focus on things which we can learn from other companies, what you can bring, and fundamentally guide the company. I think one of the words you used was guide the company rather than get into doing it. Uh, Anjali, from your perspective, you've been on several boards, and how would you see this institution, how it has evolved, and what do you think about the power this institution can bring? Your perspectives.
Thank you, Mukundan, and thank you to CII for hosting this very important sort of topic. And I'm delighted to be here with my co-panelists. I know I will learn more from this session, and that's really why I'm here. But let me share a few thoughts, and then I know we will have a longer discussion around this. Independent directors today, particularly in India, are being continuously sort of defined and underscored as gatekeepers of governance. So I want to take a step back and think about what is good governance and why are only independent directors responsible for it. I think good governance starts first with good intention. And so there is no substitution for intentionality or niyat. Our regulatory frameworks, laws, and so on are really just a framework for good intention to start with. Independent directors, to some extent, are actually kind of the fourth level. It starts first with management, the intention of management to do the right thing. Honest mistakes can be made everywhere, but to do the right thing. Then you have the auditors, you have various other gatekeepers that come in that review statements, so auditors, stock exchanges, and so on. And independent directors are part of that system. Independent directors as an institution have to work in partnership with management for the betterment, not just of minority shareholders, but actually of all stakeholders today. We are now in an environment and a system where it is not just the minority shareholders. What about the majority shareholders, as long as the intention is correct? Employees, suppliers, customers. We have seen in situations when there is failure of governance, and there have been various such instances, unfortunately, when there is a failure of governance and a company either goes down or has to stop functioning and business as usual, there is a very significant negative impact, not just on minority shareholders, but in fact, all employees, often suppliers whose payments get held up, customers who are relying on potentially critical supplies for their supply chain, whose supply chains get interrupted. So I think we have to think about the role of independent directors in partnership with management, in partnership with shareholders, not as adversaries, but for the betterment and protecting the interest of all stakeholders. Second is a point I think that Adil has also made is it is non-executive. And there is hence a clear line on where there should be a clearer line on where non-executive ends and executive begins. It seems sometimes that the responsibility and the liability on independent directors assumes a degree of information and involvement that gets perilously close to the executive side. So independent directors should actually be nose in, eyes on, hands off. And consequently, again, that partnership element, if things are working well, it is not adversarial. The role of independent directors absolutely has to be to question, to challenge, but in a constructive way for the betterment of the company and all its stakeholders. There is an element of compliance and governance, and we will talk about that. But I also want to shed light on two very other important aspects that are emerging, making your companies future ready. And today, as we have seen through COVID, boards have met a lot more frequently. The board agenda evolved again in partnership. So there was, for good boards and good companies, this was again a partnership moment where it got deepened. The board agenda evolved very quickly from business continuity and protection for health and safety of employees, of your ecosystem, to business continuity planning, and then to digitalization. So one of the positive outcomes of the COVID pandemic has been the acceleration of digitalization. And that is leading companies to realize that it is not just a channel for sales, so digital and internet, but it is actually a fairly significant strategic opportunity and consequently also a risk. The work from home, the sharing of more information, the acceleration of digitalization is creating more cybersecurity risk. So how are boards themselves, independent directors themselves getting educated, being future ready and helping companies be future ready? So that's one thing. The second is the integration of ESG into how we do business as a whole. It is no longer just a silo and a vertical where we do CSR. More and more global institutional investors and now even private capital is saying, how is business acting responsibly? So ESG being integrated into our business models is another important aspect as gatekeepers of governance. So both digital, future readiness, being prepared to run your business in a much more integrated ESG responsible way, I think are two big issues in front of boards today for independent directors, particularly in addition to everything else that has been discussed. And I know we will discuss around compliance, around governance, succession, and so on. So I'll pause there.
Thank you, Anjali. I think you sort of highlighted at the very beginning something we learned when I joined my company, the difference between Niti and Niyat. So I think we always keep worrying about more about Niyat rather than Niti. Niti can always be, it's check the box, but more deep. I think you highlighted that. I think I liked your statement of nose in, eyes on, hands off. I think that sort of captures the essence, but also the forward-looking issue related to ESG. I think all of us are really working towards things like science-based targets, becoming net zero. I think these have become very common words, what we didn't hear a couple of years ago, especially after COVID. Thank you for those words and those points of view. Ashish, at this point of time, your perspective, especially since you look at such a large swath of companies which are listed, you would also see where things are, where the things are, and how do they stack up. Also, in your partnership with so many other stock exchanges, you would see some of the practices. Maybe you could throw some light in addition to your own personal viewpoints on this institution of independent director. Over to you, Ashish.
Yeah, thank you, Mukundan, and also CII for bringing me in. And thanks to the panelists. I think most of my points are exhausted, but I can attempt to add some more. Basically, for me, when I look back, most of my life has been about corporate governance on the other side, that is as a what I call a first line regulator. And one thing I sort of always look at it is why we do things, and for me, the corporate governance is a very interesting beast. It's like driving or backseat driving by five wise men when the driver is the management and everyone is trying to then pull him into different areas. And that is basically what also brings that future ready perspective, that ultimately the management is responsible, and why we need the directors, why we need these wise men, and why we need independent wise men, because ultimately running of a corporate is basically in a way a collective affair. The owners are numerous. Literally, in my case, in many companies, I have 2 to 3 million owners in a one company. Okay, and each of them have different expectations every day. Pretty much all wins they get, and they think management should do that or do this. At the same time, the company has a particular way of doing things. It cannot just flip every moment. And so basically corporate governance for me is a very interesting philosophical discussion, saying what is it that we as a society are doing, and first thing we manufacture, in my opinion, in modern society is what I call trust. The corporate governance, in essence, is about creating that trust that people who are running the company and people who are advising them, who are overseeing the directors, are basically doing it for the betterment of the company. And nobody has seen the future. So it's a leap of faith that is happening, taking you from current to the future. Tomorrow, nobody has seen, except some of the astrologers who come on television, but I have not found them to be that reliable. So nobody has seen the future, and that's why all this collective wisdom is finally taking that company in the future, in the benefit earlier of only shareholders. It used to be shareholder democracy. Now, as Anjali said, we are stakeholder democracy. So it's not only the shareholders, but also all the stakeholders, as she mentioned. And so for me, that trust has to be there in employee, in the government, in media, and of course in the shareholders. If the shareholders are not there, then the company in a way doesn't serve its purpose. So the primary purpose is to serve the shareholders, but after serving all the others, and that's how I would put it. But finally, it's about taking the company in future, and in some ways, based on this 400-500 years of experience of managing companies, where a company, I mean, if you look at it, it's a legal fiction. All of us, I mean, our society agrees that it's called a company. That's why it's company. Even a cat exists, a dog exists. They don't have to prove their existence. A company does not exist except in the law book, right? And so to make it work, that corporate governance becomes even more important, because the brain is not the company itself. A cat's brain is cat's brain, but company's brain is its management as well as its board. And that's where I think the basic purpose, I keep on wondering all the time. In 30 years of worrying about corporate governance brings me to a single point, that that trust, which is very, very subtle, is what we manufacture. Anytime the trust goes away, in some ways, people expect, and that trust is about expectations. So if some companies are used to be doing, expected to be doing something bad, and if they do something good, that is also what I call trust deficit in another way. And the companies which are supposed to do extremely good, and they do a little bit here and there, although legally allowed, we still don't trust. I mean, the trust suddenly reduces. It's what I call Yudhishthir's Narova Kunjarova moment in corporate governance. That is my touchstone, that whether the Aswasthama Hatahat or not. And that is what basically brings me to this independent director conundrum, because many times people ask me that why we need to give exams. Why are you trying to push us into giving exams and every few years and registering us and trying to charge us and all? See, basically what happens is the perspective has changed. We have gone from what I call benign brotherhood of directors into what I call public glare. And the compliances are now taking over. So if you would have seen whether it's directors who are independent or even not independent, that are connected directors, all of them will worry about compliance, because now pretty much the entire country, entire world knows how corporates are managed, and they want more and more transparency, more and more look into what is happening. It's like doing IPL, and everyone wants to actually see the ball and the players from every angle, probably 10,000 cameras, and you can watch all those cameras. That's what everyone wants, even in our corporates functioning. And I don't see that to be wrong. If technology allows, we should basically provide for it to the extent possible. So I don't see that, but somewhere on the line, the independent directors have got more onus on them vis-a-vis the compensation they get, so to say, because the executive directors, even non-executive connected directors, have some pecuniary benefits, whereas the independent directors are not supposed to have any pecuniary benefits, or very little, if at all. And that's where the onus we put on them is immense, and they are supposed to be representing everything else, everyone else, other than this small group, which is trying to benefit themselves, of course, either the management or the promoters, as we call them in what I call Indian capital system. We are Anglo-Saxon, but our own Indian version has developed of capitalism, which is what I call promoter-driven framework in our regulations and everywhere, which is also not wrong, because it reflects the reality of that. And that's where basically one of the issues which I have been always asked is that how do you find an independent director? Is that a concept of true independence? And if that person is truly independent, would he actually care about the company, or she care about the company? So I mean, that philosophical question again would come in. And how long a person remains independent? If you remain in the company as independent director for 10 years, are you still independent? Or at 5 years, you become dependent, at least emotionally? Or at 3 years, probably you start developing feelings for the company or the company's management. The second part, which also comes to my mind since I speak and I discuss at many events, some of this may already been discussed by me earlier also. But other part which I sort of get to, people ask me is, do these independent directors depend too much on the company? Because sometimes the independent directors have a lot of demands. which once they've come in, it's like Abhimanyu. Once the Abhimanyu comes in, you can't throw him out. So then it becomes a liability. So at what stage the management also has to put a stop to those demands? The other question which people ask me is that how are these independent directors independent of each other also or not? Because there are groups of independent directors in many companies. So same 5 people will be independent directors in 5 companies. Are they really independent or are they a group? So those are also interesting questions that need to be asked, whether they actually bring, of course, if it is bringing that benefit to the company, we should basically agree to it rather than trying to say because it is prima facie not looking good, we should reject it. But idea is, these are the questions I get asked. And for me, broadly speaking, as a non-executive, non-interested director, the compliance part, the burden of compliance, to some extent, huge, at least to oversee that using auditors and other institutions, is largely on the they are also getting criminal liabilities along with other people who are having pecuniary interest, vis-a-vis these people not having pecuniary interest, still getting the criminal liabilities. So one is, of course, the compensation for them, as I mentioned, but also in some ways, what kind of obligations that need to be on them, and then they become more compliance oriented. So what I have been told by many of my CII friends also, that nowadays board meetings are 90% compliance, 5% other things, and 5% strategy. Whereas it should be exactly the other way around. Making company ready for future is 95% strategic, probably 2-3% chit chat and 3% compliance. But why the boards have become extremely compliance oriented is also because the actually compliance is now being asked for and watched and made transparent, so that and unfortunately what has happened is, earlier papers used to get lost. Now with this digital fighting, nothing gets lost. Even after 5 years, your non-compliance can come out. So many times I also say that uh, compliance may be difficult, but non-compliance now is not a choice, right? And so that's where the independent directors, many boards may particularly feel that this independent directors are like pain because they are asking for too much compliance. But it's also for the good of the company and also good long-term survival of the company. So for me, these are some of the issues which I have seen discussed. I mean, I have, of course, a full page of things, but I thought these were some interesting stuff which I thought I will bring to your notice, and then we can go on the rest of the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashish. I think your central theme was around trust. And if I were to borrow what you said about Yudhishthir, you almost have made independent director like the Krishna in the battlefield, trying to guide Arjuna. He's everywhere and not yet participating. So
He's
I sort of
non-executive.
have the imagery of,
He's non-executive.
and he's non-executive. I agree with you. Absolutely fine. One of the things which you were mentioning, just to move on, I think while we wait for the questions to come, and I think there's a difficulty. Mr. Jagdish Kapoor is not able to join because of some connectivity issues. So I think we will carry on amongst three of us and three of you all. Is that you've been looking at how can a person who is already an independent director, how can you become a better independent director? Have you have any thoughts on that in terms of we understand the compliance issues, but I think let's focus on how do we, that's the 90% of the formal board meeting. But a lot happens between director and the company outside of the board meeting informally, which is what I'm hearing all of you say. How does, because you have companies' depth of knowledge with the executive, and then you're coming in for how can you help the company? Are there any thoughts in your mind?
Sure. No, I would make 3 points, some of which are, at odds with some of the regulation or the direction which the regulation is going. So, for example, I think many of the large companies in India are quite complex. They have many divisions. They have many different kinds of businesses. If you don't understand the businesses, at least to some extent, it is very difficult to be able to do more than just make very broad statements, right? So I think the idea of having a way for the independent director to learn a little more about the company and to get a real orientation to the company, its businesses, and its people is actually quite important. That investment one has to make. Otherwise, it is very difficult to actually help the company, think about what they should be doing going forward, and even to understand the nature of the compliance and other issues that come up in a very complicated company. So first, to do that, one must learn sufficiently about the company to be able to really think ahead. Second, I find that if you're part of a membership of a set of people who are also independent directors in other companies, a good discussion with them actually helps a lot, because each one has brings out something that they have done in their companies that has been very helpful, and you learn a lot. So I guess what I'm saying is that a lifelong learning helps you be a better independent director. Whether it is courses, whether it is videos, whether it is talking to other directors, whether it is learning from some other people, whether it is learning more about the company. There is an investment to be made to be a good independent director. It isn't just that, read all the documents that come to you and make one or two great remarks. You can't really do that without really spending some time understanding it. And in this case, it creates a bit of a problem because, when you really understood the company and seen many parts of their business and the people who are there, you may now, as Ashish said, have you now become so emotionally attached to the company that you may not be independent anymore. But there is that trade-off between knowing the company and the people and how it works, and becoming and remaining independent. My sense is that it's actually helpful. On some of the boards that I've seen, people who've been there for a long time have brought incredible clarity and incredible learnings from the history of it. So it's quite helpful to have people who've been there for a while, especially good independent directors. But I would say you have to keep learning to be a good independent director.
One question, Adil, just a follow on from what you mentioned. You certainly mentioned that length of tenure need not be a negative, it could be a positive, and you're saying you should be. But is there some kind of a thoughts you have in terms of number of boards you serve? Because sometimes we do find that, there's such paucity of time, there's pressure of time, coordination of time itself. Is there some thoughts on that? Or do you have any?
I think that is actually a good one, which is the following, which is, if you're on too many boards, it's a disaster. It doesn't work. I think the Ministry of Corporate Affairs and others have put some limits on it. And I think those are reasonable. Should it be less than that? Yeah, you could argue it should be 8, not 10. It should be 5, not 7, etc. You can have long debates about it. But having some limitation on the number of boards that you're on is very important. Number one. Number two, I think it is very tough for somebody who has a full-time job to do more than 1 or 2 boards as an independent director. If you take my rule of thumb that says you have to spend between 20 or 30 days a year to be a good independent director, if you have a full-time job, can you afford to give up 60 days a year or more to being an independent director? Not really, right? So I think it does put some restrictions in terms of the kinds of people who can be on it to get on to some of the boards. And I think some limitation on the number is exactly correct. Exactly how many, I think that we can debate endlessly, but I think you'll just make a judgment at some stage and say, fine, this is how many you should be on.
Thank you, Adil. Anjali, there's some very interesting questions on the chat box. Since you worked in HR, I'm just going to but also draw on the experience because you've been on several boards, and being a women director, I think you can bring a different perspective. There's a question on dissenting voices. Do you find that dissent is allowed in boards? How do people manage dissent? And the second question is about compensation itself. Is there a way to compensate independent directors more, better, including ESOPs? You have any thoughts on that?
Sure. I want to pick up on something that Ashish was describing, and it's practicing the art of detached attachment. It's a tall order for most people, and independent directors, after all, are people. And so it is a little bit like practicing the art of detached attachment, where if you are not attached to the company, to its business, to its people, if you don't care, how will you really get involved and involved in the right way to the extent of taking risk on behalf of the company? Independent directors carry a lot of liability. And then caring enough to learn about the business, everything Adil mentioned, right? Learn the business, learn the people, be able to give the right kind of advice, ask the right questions, go through the increasing amounts of voluminous information that is sent now to independent directors, because everything has to be sent and shared. So I think there's this question and balance, and on lighter note, the detached attachment on how to achieve, it asks for super beings. That said, specifically going back to your point around compensation, I think this is an interesting question that is being debated in multiple forums right now on what is enough and should there be any compensation? Does any compensation, if I take an extreme view, does any compensation at all create non-independence? So that is one extreme view. And the other view is independent directors are giving time, carrying responsibility and liability, and sometimes more liability even than management. So should they be compensated even more than management, right? So I'm putting out these two very extreme views to actually lay out the ends of the spectrum. And I go back to what defines independence. I think independence is in the mind. Very hard to say that somebody who's been on a board for 1 year is more independent than somebody who's been on the board for 10 years. It is possible that the 1 year tenure director is actually less informed, less value adding, and may perhaps independent, but actually uncaring, less caring either also. So independence is in the mind. I completely agree with Adil. I have seen some of the most value adding, effective, independent board directors who continue to be fiercely independent in the stance they take, in the questioning of management and the challenging of points of view, even after having been on the board for many years. In fact, they bring a very unique longitudinal perspective on the industry, on the business and its people. So what is compensation? What is the right compensation? There is a defined sitting fee. So is sitting fee the right measure? Because after all, we should be paying independent directors for mind share, not for how many times they show up for a meeting. Is commission the right way? You could say commission links them to profits. So yes, it is aligned with the interest of the shareholders. But what about companies that are actually going through a stress situation? You could argue that today the two segments that actually want and need the best governance and the best kind of independent directors are stressed assets, which by definition perhaps are not going to be profitable today and for a while. So then how do independent directors get compensated? And the second is a segment I work a lot with, which is startups. Today, startups, even if they are young companies, are actually very, very large. They are fundamentally redefining segments of the economy in commerce, in logistics, in technology, and are probably better capitalized than many listed companies. They want good board members, they want good governance, but if they are not profitable, there is no commission-based way to remunerate directors. The question of ESOPs has come up in the current SEBI circular. And there are different points of view. ESOPs used to be permitted before the Companies Act 2013. And perhaps it is time to bring the ESOP back, not as a substitute for the current format of remuneration, but as an additional form that may be available to companies that do not have other currency of commission that they can remunerate independent directors with.
Thanks, Anjali. I think that also was my experience, especially companies starting out, which was getting listed overseas. They didn't have a currency except the stocks, and there was no rule prohibiting independent director from getting it. I think maybe sometimes it is an important thing to think through.
And not that we need to follow other markets, but most markets, whether it's the US, Europe, Singapore, they actually permit stock options are a permitted form of compensation, within the right framework, of course, of independence, of good governance, and independent directors also not becoming a slave to the quarterly earnings call.
Just to add to your point, I think I have found in some of the boards, the promoter directors, so-called promoter directors, are equally independent as the independent directors. So it is a state of mind, as you mentioned. Ashish, I'm going to turn to something technical which has come up. This whole issue of dual approval, the SEBI's paper, which has been put out, which is still under discussion. Do you have any views on that in terms of appointment of independent directors and removal, which has become a big issue in terms of the current discussion? Maybe that will allow them to be more independent. Is that the basis or genesis behind that, or How do you see this from a perspective of strengthening this institution? We all know this institution needs to be strengthened, but is that the right approach, or is it going to be, especially when you mentioned that India is a unique class of companies, you mentioned it is promoter companies. You said that's a very unique position India has. I think it'd be interesting to hear your views on this.
Yeah, in fact, just to retrace, the Indian style of capitalism is coming back to US and other countries also by way of the startups. They are becoming what I call the promoter managed or the entrepreneur managed companies wanting to find independent directors, as Anjali mentioned. So effectively, the Indian style where somebody has a stake itself is an interesting perspective. I don't think that complete detachment of running a company actually is that great an idea. But attachment means it comes with a lot of powers and other stuff, independent or connected directors. In terms of any activity you see, any new regulations being proposed, you see, in fact, I look at it as a continuum. Every time you had a Cadbury report, and then you had a Kumar Birla committee report. Before that, you had Irani committee report, and in corporate governance. So I go to that vintage to remind you that when Uday Kotak committee came, it was not something out of blue. It is just it was a continuum based on the experiences everyone has gained over, including Ministry of Corporate Affairs, including SEBI, exchanges, and also what is discussed in media, what are the other situations that are happening. And that is when this new independent director things started getting discussed in SEBI. It's not something which got kind of triggered by a particular event. It's a series of experiences, I would say. That is what has happened. And for me, it's not the last. It will continue to evolve because there is no, when you are collectively trying to take the company into the future, which nobody has seen, you are going to have deliberate mistakes, non-deliberate mistakes, and people are not going to find that out. Everyone will have their views on why the accident happened. And on that basis, and based on the new abilities to collect more data, make them more transparent, will come up. Ultimately, the way I look at it is that transparency is the best disinfectant. So the governments will keep on asking us for more and more data, and basically want us to provide it to our investing shareholders and also the rest of the society. And that's how I see this is a continuum, and we should take it in that spirit. But of course, the independent directors themselves have complained to all of us, including regulators, saying that the regulations are now becoming so tough and the liabilities so onerous that many of them don't want to remain independent directors. And so that is the other side of the spectrum. And at the same time, in a country of 1.4 crore, 140 crore people, we are still not getting that great independent directors, right? So we have a kind of a dilemma here that we have too many people registering in the IICA's independent director sort of portals, also probably attending those seminars which they keep on sending every week and every month, and keep on giving exams, passing them, and so on and so forth. But to help the company and help the stakeholder democracy to survive, what is required is a continuous evolution. And I take this current SEBI paper in even next few papers or next few regulations, I take it in that spirit that over a slowly, basically society, usually what I say is society tries to drive the car based on rear view mirror. We take all our past experiences and assume that those past experiences are going to be good enough to drive into the future. That's why we never look at the future usually while making policies. We take all our collective complaints and wisdom, which is gathered out of the experience of the past, not of the, nobody anticipates future in a collective way. And that's where basically whatever you see now is over 5-6 years, the issues that have been debated, discussed, and whatever has happened has now come up. And whatever decision we now take doesn't mean that it's the final one. It will continue to evolve.
Thank you, Ashish. You're saying this, the whole majority of the minority is not just the end, it could probably a continuum going forward. And at this point, Adil, maybe your thoughts on the same issue which Ashish has highlighted. In addition to that, is there a fear we have in the minds of good directors to join as independent directors? Is there a mass exodus? What is your own view of? Are you now a lot more careful than you were maybe at the beginning? I'm not saying that a lot more research, but is there a change in the perspective from your point of view?
Adil, you have
Switch it
to.
on.
Would make two observations on this, which is I think the premium has gone up on making sure that any board you're joining, you're very, very, very comfortable with the senior management and the promoter. And in fact, things will go, that you trust them a lot, right? Because there are so many things that you can get in trouble with that you don't want to take any risks whatsoever. So I think there is in terms of interest, there is a flight to quality. Any board that where there is some issue, I think will have a tough time, or where people don't think you can trust the promoters or the management, will have a very hard time getting very good independent directors, because all the good uh, IDs will be very, very, very careful in terms of who they will join, if at all. I know that some very prominent lawyers, including some of the panelists you've had on this, have basically advised people, why are you becoming an independent director? Don't be an independent director. It has too many liabilities and no upside. I don't think I'm at that stage yet, because I think the country needs this as part of governance. But I would say that most people are being very careful about what boards they choose to serve, to ensure that there's no that they can trust the people, and that there's no risk over it. That's one thing. I think that is absolutely true. That people are in fact looking at that as a way of as a way of figuring out which boards to serve and not to serve.
Thank you, Adil. And your thoughts on the same question, Anjali, in terms of the majority or minority, where do you stand on that? Would it increase the level of independence? And is there a greater scrutiny now, both by independent directors in terms of boards they join? How do you see yourself more at also general level, also at the personal level?
So absolutely, independent directors are becoming very, very mindful of which boards they will be on, uh, both from a liability, and which is not just the criminal, financial, but also the reputational liability point of view. There's no level of DNO that can cover your reputational risk. So I think that is becoming now really the defining yardstick. Is, we can call it many, many things, diligence, but it's the sniff test. So are you comfortable with, I go back to the niyat of, if it's a promoter-led company. And promoters in India are not just families and individuals, but they can be entrepreneurs, first generation. We have many situations where it is actually the government is the dominant shareholder. So what is the intention of the dominant shareholder? What is the role of the board? I find myself and many other people that we discuss often amongst ourselves, in asking very rigorous questions on what is your expectation from the board. Why does management want this board? Why does the management want this independent director? Right? So are you really going to be there to ask questions? Is dissent and open conversation, open discussion, non-agenda uh, permissible in the boardroom? So what is the tone in the boardroom? And that tone does tend to get set from the top. So the tone from the top that comes from the chairman, spending time with the chairman, spending time with the CEO, spending time with the dominant shareholders, whether it is government, promoter, etc. I think board members today, to Ashish's point, while yes, the list is getting longer, the number of board members, however, that seems to be actually shrinking, because uh, perhaps the better board members, and I'm putting this in quotes, who knows what that means, the better board members actually have many more demands on their time. They are more sought after. They're getting very picky, as they should, on which boards they want to be on and which companies they want to be associated with, and more importantly, where do they want to put their reputational sort of influence, as it were. So yes.
I just want to make one comment, if I may, Mukundan. I
Yeah.
didn't answer your question on the majority of minority, right? shareholders. And I have I am in two minds about that. I understand the principle behind it, but let's look at how mutual funds and lots of foreign investors vote as minority shareholders, right? Forget about the individual shareholders. A large proportion of them, because we've had this discussion with them, they say, listen, we've invested in 100 stocks. You think we have any, we don't have the capacity to think about this question for them. So we are guided by, or we just go by whatever is the set of rules that we've come up with, or what any of the institutional, what are they called? IISL or something. I think you will.
Proxy advisors.
Advisory.
Advisories.
Proxy
Right,
advisors.
right, advisories. And the advisories had very, fixed rules about this. You are over this age, you have done this, you've done this, therefore you should not be. And, 2 years ago, we had this case where, I won't name it just because it'll embarrass some people, but where, one of the founders and, any common sense would say you want to keep this person on the board. And the advisories came out and said, according to our criteria, it doesn't fit. And so it failed the smell test. So my view is that, do you really want to put majority of the minority where they are not really taking thoughtful decisions, but are taking some rules-based decisions based on what the advisory firms are doing? Do we have the system and infrastructure in place to go for better rational decision making on that? And I have a question on that. I'm not sure that we are at that level. So that's why I raised that question.
Mukundan, may I add to that actually?
Sure.
I think some of
Go.
the, particularly since the larger institutional investors in India are not always Indian, and many of them are foreign, there is a context to everything. And thus, this rule-based, rules are good. We like rules, right? We all like rules. Rules are good. I think in concept, the majority of the minority is the right way to do things, because you're giving a bigger share of voice on important governance matters to the minority shareholders. And in markets like ours, where yes, you do have promoter dominance and so on, so the majority of the minority, from an intent and a sort of in principle point of view, makes a lot of sense. But when it is rule based and somewhat non-contextual, advisory based decision driving, we run the risk of taking something which is meant for a different market and applying it without customizing it to our market. I want to leave it at that. I think it's the right thing to do, but has to be applied, as most rules are, with some contextualizing for what works here.
Thanks a lot, Anjali, for that, and thanks for Adil for that intervention, bringing the overall context on this issue. I think we're almost at the end of the session, so I would very, very interesting points and very interesting issues have been raised. Some of them are very clear. Some of them are still, something which will evolve, as Ashish says, everything evolves over a period of time. So I'm going to leave to three panelists any closing comments they have. So Ashish, let me start with you. Any closing comments quickly, and then Adil, and then Anjali.
As usual, I learned a lot with my panelists, and of course the person who asked us the questions. I think he's a very humble doyen of the corporate world. So I think, Mukundan, thank you. But overall, this concept of corporate governance is going to evolve and more what I call rule-based, criteria-based, transparent, non discriminatory or non-favoring situations will be asked by public, and we will have to, in a way, slowly fall in place. I think, and we have, India is pretty much the most compliant nation, I say, and that has been proven by even COVID experience, that once it comes to that, we all fall in place. And so many times, even when about women directorships, I speak at UN and other places, I say that our regulators take the best practice from elsewhere and then make them into regulations. Whereas otherwise they have to, those companies have to employ McKinsey's, whereas our regulator actually puts them into committees. So all of us get it free of charge, right? So with that, I will close my sort of comment just now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashish. Adil, since he commented McKinsey, over to both the McKinsey alumni here.
First of all, I think as a country, we have made a huge number of steps forward in terms of overall governance. If you went back and looked at our scores on corporate governance 20 years ago, 10 years ago, our companies have gotten better and better. And I think, therefore, the broad direction, I think, is very good. And that's the direction that we should go in. And I support that. But, this is a constantly evolving area. I think we have to get better and better and better. No country has figured this out. Let us remember that we have lots of scandals in many parts of the world. We always used to think that Germany's corporate governance was terrific, and they've had such a mess recently on several companies that I won't name and several banks. We used to think Switzerland was very good, and they've had a huge mess. UK companies, US companies. So I think some of this happens. We learn from it. We should not overreact to just one or two incidents. We should be thoughtful about it. And my only guidance would be that in addition to making sure that we take care of the scandals, let's also think hard about how do we raise the average level of compliance and governance, and that how do we make our best companies among the best in corporate governance worldwide. I think we have to raise for all three, the laggards, the average, and the best.
Thank you, Adit. Anjali?
Mukundan, I would actually love to hear from you, because we all know that you yourself are an expert in corporate governance and have led us on this issue in so many other forums. So would love to hear from you before we close the panel. But I have learned a lot here. I agree actually with everything that has been said by my co-panelists as well, and cannot agree more that this is an evolving journey. I think when we talk about corporate governance, we always tend to focus on the companies that are already practicing good governance and best governance sometimes, but at least have the right intent. If we can solve for that big middle and make it easier for them to follow good governance in both letter and spirit, because it is not just about compliance. Good boards, good independent directors actually add a lot of value to companies and enable them to attract good board members to follow good governance. I think it will help our economy and the development of our economy significantly. So I'm going to pause there, but before we close, would love to hear from you.
Thank you, Anjali, and thank you, Adil and Ashish, all A's. That's why this has been such a great panel. And really, I learned a lot personally. But I think one thing I will take away from here is that this is a journey. I think that's really what has come out, that this is just one of the milestones as we move forward. And second thing, Anjali, I want to borrow from what you said, that our task of building this institution should be to focus on that middle, which we don't sometimes doesn't make the headlines. The good ones make the headlines, the scandals make the headline, but the middle doesn't. How do we raise the average? I think that's a very different way of looking at it. And also thanks to all of you having brought in the perspective that this is not just about companies which are listed, it is about startups. There are many other elements which we need to think about fairly deeply, which we also need to bring to bear this power of this institution. But as has been said, it's a very, very difficult task which independent directors face, especially this attached detachment or detached attachment, whichever way you want to use. And at the same time, tick the boxes on compliance, yet get involved with the company. I think it's a very, very tough balancing act. And hopefully our discussions like this will help us move in the right direction. I want to thank all the panelists. I want to thank CII for organizing this. And it's been a terrific 1 hour. I've been stuck to the screen, hearing all of you. And thank you for being such a great, bringing all those insights to all of us. Thank you. And over to you, Vikas, for closing.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mukundan, and thank you all the panelists. I think it's been also a learning experience for me also, as well as I'm sure to all the participants also. And I think the two key takeaways, which for me are one, the quote which was mentioned, that practicing the art of detachment with attachment. I think that sets this apart in terms of how independent a director is and how he or she will take truly the role of being an independent director on the board. And of course, back to the drawing board and the basic principles of niti versus niyat and the self-conscious and self-governance. I think if we clearly understand the key meanings of this, the liability or the roles and responsibilities fall in place. So with these words, I once again thank you all for your time. Mr. Adil Bhai, Mr. Ashish Kumar Chauhan, Anjali Bansal, thanks for your perspectives, and also to Mr. Mukundar for steering and moderating this session. So thank you very much all, and this also brings to a close to the CII Corporate Governance Summit. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.